Good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with another of our virtual events. And tonight, we're really excited to have Jance with us once again.
Close it and sign in again.
Okay.
No,
so we're
not you, Patrick.
Oh, right.
This is someone who had signed in and was talking to me before anybody else could get on, and she's still at the wrong place.
Oh, okay.
Well, let me just break in and say, for anybody who wants to watch this that is in the wrong place, Patrick, I don't know if we can tell them, but they should just go to poisonedpen.com and click on Facebook video, and they will be there.
That's right. It should. And if you can't see it at the event itself, go to the live section and you should see it. It should be the first thing there. But anyway, I can put all that in the comments field as well. But anyway, I just wanted to hold up. We've got signed copies of Judy's new book, Missing and Endangered, signed in the customary red pen. And if you're watching at home on Facebook, I'll be monitoring the Facebook feed, and we'll be happy to ask any questions that you might have for Judy. I don't know, 35 or 40 minutes into the program. And Barbara is at home in her office, and she is going to take over.
Thank you, Patrick. Judy, congratulations to another book, your 19th Joanna Brady plus 2 novellas. And today is publication day, so I'm drinking a little toast to you. One advantage of being at home is I can actually do that because I'm not driving.
I'll have to have my own toast after we finish this talk.
Okay, we can do that.
I'm not allowed before a talk, only after.
Oh, are we afraid you won't make any sense? Well, I want everybody to notice if I stand up tall, I am in honor of tonight wearing my own Bisbee turquoise, which as you can see is a lighter color than a lot of Arizona turquoise. And I bought it, or my husband actually bought it for me on a trip to Bisbee. So we haven't really ever talked about Bisbee. And since we have a much bigger audience now, Judy, than people who just live in Arizona, I thought it might be fun to talk just a little bit about Bisbee to kind of orient them for people who are watching us from, let's say, Pennsylvania.
Well, as you can see, I too am wearing Bisbee blue tonight.
Yes, you are.
Bisbee was once a booming copper mining town in southeastern Arizona. It's where I grew up. And Bisbee blue is a strain of turquoise that came from the underground mines. And if the miners happen to run into a vein of turquoise, they chip that one out, and those pieces would go into lunch pails and go back up the shafts. And that was called high grading, and it was frowned on, but it was very much a done thing. Bisbee, early on, Bisbee had the only opera house between St. Louis and San Francisco. It was a very interesting place to grow up, and who I am and the values I have came largely from being a part of growing up in that place.
But you're originally from South Dakota. So, I mean, you were born there. So I find it interesting that, when did you move to Bisbee?
Well, we moved to Bisbee in 1949. My father had been bedridden with arthritis. And in view of the fact that my parents had a farm with 17 cows to milk and 3 kids to raise, it was sort of inconvenient to have my dad bedridden. A doctor in Millbank told my father, "You need to move to a high, dry climate." And legend has it that my mother hauled out her ragged geography book. Her favorite class in school was geography. She opened it to a map of Arizona. She pointed in the lower right-hand corner of the map to Bisbee and said, "This is high and dry, we're moving there." So they sold the farm and loaded their worldly possessions into a trailer, what's now sort of an Airstream. including 300 quarts of my mother's canning from the previous year. We left the farm on the 28th of January when it was 28 degrees below zero. I don't remember that. I do not remember the 5 days we were stranded in Enid, Oklahoma in a snowstorm. What I do remember was the day in the middle of March, 6 weeks later, when we moved into the house on Yuma Trail. And I remember standing outside, hanging on the ornamental fence, looking up at the blue sky overhead and feeling the sun all over my body. And at age 4, that was the beginning of my love affair with Arizona.
That's a wonderful story. Now tell me this, it's been maybe 20 years since I've actually been to Bisbee. And if I recall right, the famous old hotel there is the Copper Queen. Do I have that right?
The Copper Queen Hotel, yes. And it's a quirky place. There's a J.A. Jance room and a Teddy Roosevelt room and a John Wayne room.
No Tom Mix?
No Tom Mix. Tom Mix was Tucson.
Well, true, and he died on the road, coming up from, but how far is Bisbee from Tucson? There's a lot of driving in your book that we're going to talk about. So it's sort of good to orient people.
Well, it's 100 miles from Bisbee to Tucson. And Joanna Brady's home at High Lonesome Ranch is another 7 miles beyond Bisbee. It's approximately half an hour from Bisbee to Sierra Vista on the left and Douglas on the right. It's about 7 miles to the international border with Mexico. And so as a child growing up, I was very aware of how long it took to get from one place to another place. Until I was in college, I-10 didn't exist from Benson north to Phoenix. It was still a 2-lane highway. I think people don't realize how big Joanna's jurisdiction is. Cochise County, in that far southeastern corner of the state, is 80 miles long and 80 miles wide, and or 80 miles wide and tall, whichever it is. I don't know. I can't figure it out tonight. It's too complicated. But that's a lot of square miles to cover. And she has to do so with a very limited number of sworn officers because her department has only so many deputies, and then there's clerical help, there are jail guards and so forth. So it's the law enforcement presence is very thin on the ground.
Is Bisbee big enough to have a police chief and a police force as Tucson is, or is the sheriff the law in Bisbee?
No, Bisbee has its own police department and its own fire department.
Okay. And how about the mine? I know that the mine, well, at least I think when I was there, it was no longer being worked. It was a tourist attraction. And I remember getting into a hard hat and descending into the mine, which is a gigantic open pit mine. Did it close while you were there, or is it still active? I don't really know.
The mines shut down in the mid 70s.
Okay.
It was a company town. There was a company store where people could buy groceries and have it come out of their paychecks at the end of the next 2 weeks. And the company store offered everything from washing machines to bacon and eggs. It was once the mine shut down, then Bisbee almost disappeared off the map. And now it has returned primarily as a tourist attraction. And a lot of those tourists happen to be J.A. Jance fans.
Oh, how very fortunate. I think there's also art there. I mean, it's like Jerome at the, at the other end of up by Sedona. Jerome was an old mining town. And now, it's a tourist attraction. It's an art town, has some good restaurants, all that thing.
My favorite Jerome story, a lot of people who left Jerome closed far earlier, and people who left Jerome ended up going to Bisbee, miners and when the Bisbee mines closed, miners from Bisbee ended up going to places like Safford. So the miners migrated. And the miners who came to Bisbee originally, people say, well, why do you write about pasties in your book? Well, a lot of the miners who left England and Cornwall and Wales when the tin mines gave out, went to Michigan and then ended up coming to Bisbee. And so pasties were a big deal in Bisbee. I mean, pasties are a meat pie. It's a crust, and half of it is the way it used to be. Is half of it was savory with meat and potatoes or meat and turnips or whatever, and the other half was filled with some kind of fruit filling. So it was one handful of food that was both main meal and dessert at once. But that's how pasties came into my life and into my books. But the men who worked in the mines, including my father, didn't want their kids to work in the mines. And so they did their best to aim us in a direction where we wouldn't end up having to do what they did. My father, when we moved to Bisbee, he went to work in the mines originally. And then he and a man he met working in the mine opened a construction company. And eventually, when they sold that, my father went into the life insurance business. Well, I was writing the second Joanna Brady book. I was supposed to be writing the second Joanna Brady book. And the story had sort of stalled out, and I was dealing with writer's block. So someone told me about a book called Going Back to Bisbee, written by a man named Richard Shelton, who was actually a teacher at Lowell Elementary School when I was a student at the next school over, Greenway. And so in the guise of doing research, I read that book. It was writer's block, pure and simple. But in reading Richard Shelton's book, I unlocked part of my own history so I could understand it better. He wrote about how when he came to Bisbee, he was shocked by the class segregation that existed in Bisbee. On the one hand, there were the white collar workers, the mining executives, the bankers, the insurance people, the lawyers, the company bigwigs. Those were all one part of society. And the other society were all the blue collar workers, the people who worked in the stores, the people who worked in the mines. And what Richard Shelton discovered was that as a teacher, he was expected to hang out with the white collar workers and not mingle with the blue collar workers at anything other than a school function. And all of a sudden, a light dawned on me. I was growing up, I had this sense of being an outsider. And part of it happened because when we came to Bisbee, my dad worked in the mines, and then he ran a construction company. That put us in the blue collar camp. When I was in 7th grade, he went into the life insurance business and moved to the white collar camp, leaving his kids in sort of this social limbo because the white collar kids didn't want to accept us And the blue collar kids didn't trust us anymore. And that was a very important aspect of my becoming a writer, because that turned me into an observer rather than an active participant. And I think that's always been one of my strong suits as a writer. I'm a keen observer of the people and things going on around me, and I use those things to go into my books. One of my early adopters, who stayed up until 3 o'clock this morning reading the book because it came in at midnight, wrote to me and said, when she got to the part in the story where where Jenny and her friend, her rodeo riding friend Nick, are calling each other Sarah Sponda. Well, that's their nicknames for it. It's sort of a secret handshake. But Sarah Sponda is Sarah Sponda, Sarah Sponda, Sarah Sponda, Red Set. That's a song I learned in Girl Scouts when I was in Girl Scouts. And so I put that in, and yet it was a touchstone in that book that really spoke to that particular reader.
You know, I was going to bring up going back to Bisbee. In fact, I asked Patrick to, because he's at home, to see if he could chase up his copy so we could talk about it. But in the process, I looked at it again and I remembered that there you are, Patrick, and there's your copy, Going Back to Bisbee by
I
Richard.
dug all over the place for it. I finally found it.
I know we had one at the store, but there was a one book Arizona program that was run by the West Valley Arts Council, if I remember. And in 2007, Going Back to Bisbee was the one book Arizona that everybody read and then talked about. And it generated a load of conversation. Many, many people read it. We had trouble keeping it in stock for a long time. So I recalled it when I was reading. Well, I always do when I think about Joanna, but particularly when reading Missing and Endangered, I thought about a lot of things. I mean, you don't write about the mine, so I figured the mine is closed. I thought about the fact that Cochise County is so large, and one of her problems in this book is that she's losing deputies, or she's losing staff and isn't quite sure what to do about that. One of whom is unfortunately quite up close to the beginning of the book, is shot, and one isn't sure how he's going to do. He's airlifted off to the hospital. And the other was that because they are not just driving around Cochise County, but also Bush makes a trip up to Flagstaff. You know, we're at NAU part of the time. And I was just there in January, and Judy, it was wonderful. We were driving around the campus. It was on the winter break. I stepped out of the car, and this little R2D2 thing was rolling up the street at me. And it was a robot delivering pizza to one of the NAU dorms. And it rumbled by, but it was so funny. You know, I stood there and I watched it. It was two balls, you know, kind of rolling towards me and then rolling past, and it had a little sign on it, you know, saying delivery. And it was clearly heading off. And I realized how big NAU has grown. I mean, it's really a big.
It's massive.
Place.
It's massive.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. But I think what, you know, your Allie Reynolds series is set north of Phoenix, but mostly around Preston, Sedona and so forth. But I thought this book was especially interesting because you're all the way from Sierra Vista to Flagstaff. And as I said, there's a lot of moving around in the book.
There's a lot of drive time.
Yeah, you know, Arizona, it's really big. I always surprise British authors when we talk to them by pointing out you could drop the entire British Isle into Arizona.
Well, Bisbee, if Arizona became a lot more approachable once they raised the speed limit to 75. At 55, Arizona took forever.
That's absolutely true. And for ages, you know, there was a terribly dangerous road from Phoenix, really from Scottsdale out to Fountain Hills, going up north to Payson. And, you know, Highway I can't remember what it's 87 that goes north to Sedona, but I can't remember what the highway might be 87. Anyway, it had the highest traffic fatality rate in the state. And they finally, turned it into a divided 4-lane highway, which makes it remarkably easier to drive around Arizona. But I don't know how the roads are down because I haven't spent a lot of time there, about how fast the driving would be from Bisbee to Douglas or Bisbee to Sierra Vista or Bisbee to Tucson.
Well, it's mostly 65. But something I'd like to talk about for a moment is the reason Joanna and Butch are involved with NAU is that's where Joanna's daughter, Jenny, is a sophomore in college. I first met Jennifer Ann Brady in the first scenes of Desert Heat 19 books ago. It was the evening of her parents' 10th wedding anniversary. She was 9 years old, and at Greenway School, which Jenny was attending, they just had this little smidgen of sex ed. And Jenny was smart enough to get that message and count up the numbers on her fingers and figure out that there weren't quite enough months between her parents' 10th wedding anniversary and her birthday. And so sitting with her mother and her grandmother, waiting for her dad to come home so her parents can go out to celebrate their anniversary, Jenny drops a bombshell into the conversation by asking her mom a question. Mom, was I a preemie? Well, of course, she was not a preemie. She was on time. The wedding was what was late. And this has been a matter of absolute warfare between between Joanna Brady and her mother, Eleanor. Eleanor has been on a tear over the fact that Joanna got pregnant out of wedlock at age 17, and Eleanor has never gotten over it. Well, we don't find out until years later that Eleanor and Joanna's father, D.H. Lathrop, had a baby out of wedlock before they got married too, only they gave that baby up for adoption. So that issue that Jenny pops out of her mouth on page 1, scene 1 in the book is this thread that leads all the way through all of these books. This afternoon, I received an email from someone who said, I just started the book, and within 2 pages, I'm feeling completely at home because I watched Jenny grow up from the time she was little.
True. And now she has 2 extremely young siblings.
Yes.
Joanna and Butch have had 2 children. And
I have had people write to me and say Joanne Brady is too old to be having more kids, and with her dangerous job, she shouldn't be having any. And everybody's entitled to their opinion, but I'm sorry, I'm writing the books.
You get to decide her life. I think it's wonderful that you were able to plumb back into family history to come out with this information about Joanna's parents, both of whom now are deceased. We've come a long way in 19 books with how lives change. One of the things I always like about your books is the way that the characters react to the events of the previous books. They're not Teflon. And, when you start a new book, we're always conscious of the things that led them to the place they are when you start the new book. And I really like that. It does feel, like you're doing family history when you read them.
Well, I grew up reading John D. MacDonald's Travis McGee books, and I loved those books. And it's one of the reasons I felt it would be possible to write a series. But in a lot of ways, reading a Travis McGee book was sort of like Groundhog Day, because he never changed. a beautiful woman would come along, and he was always a sucker for her, no matter what. And he always lived on the busted flush. Nothing in his life seemed to be based on what went before. And that's one of the things I decided I would do differently when I started writing about all of my characters. And so, yes, I'm always conscious of the fact that they have a history. And it's my obligation as the writer to remember that history and try to keep it straight. Sometimes I mess up, and then people write to me and tell me about it. I'm grateful for sharp-eyed readers, and I always tell them so. But I'm always a little bemused by that as well, because if I spotted an error in somebody else's book, I would not feel obliged to sit down and write them a letter and say, hey, you're stupid, you did this. But, everybody's different.
It's interesting, but it's a sign, Judy, I think, of how invested that fans get in the characters and the world that you've created. And it's probably an irritant to them, although some of them are just showing off, that. But, I think for many of them, it's just kind of an irritant, that this universe that you've constructed has just gone slightly out of whack,
Yes,
when
yes.
there is something like that. And I think
And they hold me fully responsible. It's as it should be.
Yeah. Sorry, but you really are. You're the god of this universe. There it is. But I was thinking about, you're two of the people that work for Joanna in the sheriff's department, one of whom is about to retire. And his medical history has come back into play. And then another one is shot. And if he comes back to work, if he survives, I don't want to spoil anything by talking about that, but should he survive and come back to work, he's had a really terrible wound.
And he may be on limited duty.
Exactly.
And of course, there's one young woman who has been a clerk in the public office there at the sheriff's department. And Joanna hired her because she was widowed. She was the widow of one of her deputies. And Joanna hired her to be a clerk, but the young woman now wants to be a deputy in her own right, because I'm sorry, the way the world works, deputies out on patrol earn more money than clerks working in the office. And she's the sole support of a young child, and she needs to earn more money.
Well, that's true. But you also point out that, while she came into the clerk's job, as it was kind of a charity act and she wasn't all that excited about it, by working there, she's really become interested in police work. So, sure, part of it's the money, but I think you went to some trouble to say that she's really interested in being a deputy in the job.
Well, one of the things that I believe as I create these casts of characters is that police officers are people first. They're people before they become cops, and they're people after they become cops. And I try to make clear that that's the case, that these aren't automatons walking around just going blam, blam, blam at whoever happens to be around. They really are people, and they're affected, deeply affected by the crimes and the crime scenes they encounter. They don't walk away from those scenes without carrying something of whatever happened there imprinted on their souls.
Well, but Joanna came to this, I don't mean but, let's start over again. Joanna came to the job because her husband, Andy, was killed. And
they thought she would be a charity case too.
Well, but he was running for election and she was persuaded to do it and surprisingly won. But then I think you also point out, how hard she worked to learn the job. And she does run the sheriff's department to some degree, although it has the obvious discipline and everything, but like an extended family. She runs it differently than a guy would run it.
I was at a book signing in Phoenix. And when it was time for questions, this woman held up her hand and she said, "My father was a doctor. My husband is a doctor, but that doesn't mean I can be a doctor." And just because Joanna's father was sheriff and her husband was a deputy sheriff doesn't mean Joanna can be sheriff. And I said, well, no, she won the election and she realized she wasn't a sheriff, that she wasn't professional law enforcement. So in book 3, she actually sends herself to the police academy. And I asked the woman who asked me the question, well, did you read that book? And she said, no, I don't like the Joanna Brady books.
Oh, you never do know what's going to come out of people's mouths, do you? But it's true that Joanna sent herself to the academy to learn the job, and she's happy to have other people become educated in it. But anyway, what's interesting also to me about this book is because we've already pointed out that Jenny is up in Flagstaff, where she has a roommate named Beth, who is very unworldly and is getting into trouble. And then down here in Bisbee, we have
The officer involved shooting.
we have a domestic that he's called to serve a warrant and winds up getting shot, and bad things happen. So you have 2 cases going on, 2 investigations, one up north and one down in Bisbee. And while Joanna's not working the case up north, because she really can't, she doesn't have jurisdiction up there.
She's affected by it.
Right. That one is we see that from Jenny and Beth's perspective. So you're telling that story. And then down in Bisbee, we have Joanna working that case with, I might say, a number of other law enforcement agencies, because there are several of them that wind up getting involved in this, what originally looks like just a domestic case. So I thought that was an interesting construction. Did you, when you started out, which was the plot that you started with? I know I've read that you like to start out with a body, you like to kill somebody and then spend the rest of the book trying to figure out why this person died and who did it.
Actually, I started the book with the idea of the online predator. I had watched a show on ID Discovery on Web of Evil, a Web of Lies, in which an online predator, this middle-aged man posing to be a college-age kid, creates this connection between himself and a 16-year-old girl in Scottsdale, as I recall. And eventually he encourages her to send him naked selfies of her. And then it's called sextortion. He tells her if she doesn't do exactly what he says, he's going to release the photos to the internet. Well, in that case, the mother, the girl's mother, the girl had threatened suicide. The girl's mother got wind of it, and she actually raised enough hell that the guy was tracked down and put a stop to it. But that was the one part of the story that was floating around in my head. The domestic violence issue, again, it came from a piece of email that came into me from a fan. It was a year ago at Christmas time. And this woman said that her son had been in a very abusive marriage, and he left, and the mother had cut off all access for him to have to his kids. And the grandmother wrote to me and said that she was leaving her Christmas tree up until her granddaughters could come and get their Christmas presents and unwrap them. That was Christmas a year ago, and that Christmas tree never went down. But when we hear the word domestic violence, we're all sure that, and most of the time it is, the man who is the bad guy, the man who is the abuser. But I took that story in this book and sort of turned it on its ear. And the character in this book, in the book Field of Bones, the character that won my heart was Letitia Markham. She was a remarkable character, and I still can't get her out of my head. In this book, it's a 7-year-old girl named Kendall, and she is living in this totally dysfunctional family with a mother who is a total fruitcake, and her only guiding star, her North Star, is her stepfather. And he's the guy who is shot in the opening pages of this book. He is shot and dies. And Kendall, she's so resourceful, and she's so determined to protect her little brother. Her brother's a baby, he's only 5. She looks out the window, she sees the blood under her father's body. She knows her father is dead, but she doesn't tell her little brother because he's too little. Kendall really won my heart.
Well, not only that, but the little brother has sustained a really tragic loss, which is his beloved dog named Coon. And the mother, who is a really despicable character, has, told him that the dog broke out, ran away, and, I can't remember, either run over or disappeared.
She told him he got run over.
Right, and was dead. And so the dog is kind of a specter out there, but the little boy has already endured the loss of his dog. And I think I felt like Kendall felt he just couldn't sustain another major loss. So she tries to protect him. And I'm so moved by the fact that they were terrified of mom's boyfriend. And so they didn't want to step out of their room. So she had, the equivalent of a
Ash of food.
Well, she had a stash of food and all, but she also had basically a pee bucket, so they didn't have to venture out to the bathroom and so forth. And, it's a really moving story of these 2 kids that are, trying to take care of themselves and under siege while their mother, whose taste in men is clearly not.
And when their grandmother shows up
and
takes them shopping, and they can have anything they want to buy. They can go to the pancake house and they have as many pancakes as they want. It's like a miracle to them. And boy, those kids really worm their way into my heart. I don't suppose that seems sort of nuts. And maybe you have to be nuts to be able to write books. But those 2 little kids really won me over in this book.
Well, let's give a shout out too to the grandmothers, because there's more than one. There are at least 2 dysfunctional mothers, but there are 2 very functional grandmothers in this book. And I thought that you must have done some research about custody laws and grandparent rights and what can happen. So who do you rely on, for information about legal matters?
Well, we have our attorney who handles our estate matters, and I can pose questions to her, and if it's something that has to do with another state, she points me in the right direction.
Well, I did think that you needed to do a deep dive into custody laws and other things to make this book work out. And, the fact that it also took multi-agent cooperation to resolve both cases was really interesting too. So you must have learned, because of the Beaumont books as well, you must have really learned a lot about police procedure over the years, even though you're not an actual serving officer.
I was driving my grandson to youth group the other night, and I was explaining to him how when I started writing the Beaumont books in the 1980s, There was no such thing as DNA. At that point, what they could take away from a crime scene was maybe fingerprints that had to be checked against individual fingerprint cards.
Yeah.
And if they found blood, what they could do was type it, and they could tell if it was A, B, O, or whatever. But there was no way to do DNA and point directly to a killer. So APIS, the integrated fingerprint identification system, wasn't even in its infancy when I started writing the Beaumont books. That came on later. So crime scene forensics have changed remarkably in the 40 years I've been doing this.
They really have. Not only that, you've had to, and you do this in the Allie Reynolds books, you've had to do a lot about cybercrime, because in order to deal with the problem that Jennifer and Beth have, it takes a lot, it's the cybercrime, essentially, the sexting and the sextortion and whatever. So you've obviously worked out, how that kind of a case would be handled. Again, you must have had some sort of expert. Is Bill good enough to give you all that, or do you have to go further afield?
No, Bill is my go-to guy when it comes to tech stuff. And he's the one who, years ago, I was sitting in my chair and he's sitting next to me and he said, AI is pretty interesting. You should write a book about AI. And I said, I'm a liberal arts major. What do I know about artificial intelligence? But he fed me material, and gradually I created Frigg, that ongoing character, AI character, who is a part of the Allie Reynolds books. And I have people who write to me and say, I really like Frigg. And I'm thinking, whoa.
You can humanize anything. Well, I love the fact that with Joanna Brady and Allie Reynolds, you were really covering large swaths of Arizona, and even Beaumont. JP Beaumont's been down to Arizona a couple of times, once on his own at least. And then I remember he and Joanna actually worked a case together at some point. I don't remember titles anymore.
It was Partner in Crime.
Thank you.
They were out struggling their way up
Yeah.
the San Pedro River, which means they were going toward Mexico. The San Pedro is I believe one of the only rivers in this country that runs south to north.
Oh, okay. Right.
Because the headwaters for that are across the line in Mexico.
Well,
I think a lot of people, if they've never been to Arizona, they have this vision in their heads that as soon as they cross the state line, they're going to be driving around in a forest of saguaros. But there are no saguaros in Cochise County. There's not a single one below the county line coming from Tucson south to Bisbee. And when I wrote my first Joanna Brady book, I told my editor, I said, John, there aren't any saguaros in Cochise County, so don't put a saguaro on the cover.
Yeah.
So a couple of months later, he called me up and he said, you're going to be getting a FedEx package today. Do not open it until you have me on the phone. Sure enough, the first cover for Desert Heat had a saguaro on the cover.
Yes, well, it's a cactus that has moved to many environments in which it does not thrive. That is absolutely for sure. Patrick, why don't you come back and tell us if we have questions from the audience that you'd like to discuss? Patrick is a native Arizonan, so he really likes talking about books that are about Arizona.
I'm not quite native. I came here when I was 3.
Oh, sorry.
But, yeah, close enough. Judy, do you know this book, The Bisbee 17? By
I
Robert
do know
Houston?
that book, yes. I know Bisbee
Yeah.
17.
Good book. Yeah, we have a lot of people watching and chiming
Actually,
in.
in Bisbee, Arizona. when I was growing up, if you went in certain places and came up on the wrong side of the deportation, you could find yourself going to Fist City. So the Bisbee 17 lines of demarcation still existed very strongly in the Bisbee I grew up in. And for all I know, they probably still do. Are you hearing a cracking in the background from my end?
A little bit, but not too bad.
That's rain falling on the skylight, and God love us, it's melting the snow. We had a foot full of snow this weekend here in where I live. And I have little miniature, long-haired miniature dachshunds with 4-inch legs. And even standing on tiptoe, they couldn't see over the top of a foot of snow. So I'm really glad the rain is here.
Wish it were here, believe me. We could.
Yeah, no
certainly use
kidding.
it. Yep.
And you know, there are people literally from all over the world that are tuning in. There's somebody from Australia, and also a couple of people from Texas, and you can tell that they're having a rough time of it out there right now. But lots of questions. Patricia asks, how much of your character's life trajectory or trajectories have been in your mind throughout your journey as an author? What has been the most surprising development in the life of one of your characters?
Well, number one, there is no pre-planned trajectory. I never did outlining. I hated outlining when I met it in 6th grade. Nothing that has happened to me in the intervening decades has changed my mind. I know J.K. Rowling had the whole Harry Potter series outlined in advance before she ever started writing. That's not me. When I started writing, I thought I was writing a 1-book standalone book. I didn't know I was writing a series. So in that fashion, everything that's happened to them has been a surprise. But I think the thing that surprised me most in the Joanna Brady books is in book number 5, Skeleton Canyon. She has gone to a crime scene and she's giving George, the medical examiner, a ride back to Bisbee from the crime scene. I don't know why he didn't show up in his van. Anyway, they were riding along, Joanna is at the wheel, and he drops the bomb that between books, while my readers had their backs turned and while the writer had her back turned, George and Joanna's mother, Eleanor, had eloped. Joanna almost wrecked the car, and I almost dropped my computer. We were both really surprised. So I guess that's the thing that surprised me the most. But in a recent book, Beaumont was really astonished when somebody knocked on the door and had an infant carrier, and in the infant carrier was a baby who was the daughter of the daughter J.P. Beaumont never knew he had. So that was sort of a big surprise too. So things surprised me. If I always knew in advance what was going to happen to my characters, I would have no motivation to write the book.
Can you talk a little bit about your novel Second Watch? I know that was a deeply personal book.
It was a deeply personal book. It's hard to remember how old my characters are or when their birthdays are. And so with J.P. Beaumont, I cheated. I gave him my birthday. We were both born on the 27th of October, 1944. And at Thanksgiving one year, we were sitting around eating turkey. This was back in the old days when you could actually have a Thanksgiving dinner and invite people. My one son said, you know, Mom, J.P. Beaumont is getting sort of long of tooth. Have you ever thought of writing a J.P. Beaumont prequel? And I said, no, Tom, I've never thought about writing a prequel. And then time passed. Suddenly it was October and time to write the next Beaumont book. And the only idea I had was to write a prequel. So I was sitting in my writing chair in the family room with the blank computer screen sitting there facing me. And I was thinking about Bo and how old he was. And then I realized that he and I were the same age, and that a year ahead of me at Bisbee High School was a guy named Doug Davis. Doug was smart, he was handsome, he was an outstanding athlete. He graduated as valedictorian of the class in 1961. He went from Bisbee High School to West Point to Ranger School to Vietnam, where he died weeks before his 23rd birthday. And I missed his funeral in Bisbee. I didn't find out about it until after it had happened. I was living in Las Vegas that summer, and if I had known his funeral was going to be, I would have piled in a car and come to Bisbee for it. But I always felt guilty that I didn't attend his funeral. So sitting there in my chair, I thought, well, what if I had J.P. Beaumont, who's a year younger than Doug, encountered Doug Davis in Vietnam? So over the years, through pure coincidence, I had become friends with Bonnie Abney, a woman who had been engaged to marry Doug at the time he died. And so I called Bonnie and I asked her what she would think if I tried to intertwine Doug's real life with Bo's fictional one. And she said, well, let me think about it for a couple of days. At that point, Doug's mother was gone, his brother was gone. Bonnie was the only person left to ask. And so she called me back a couple of days later and she said, I think my Douglas would be safe in your hands. And so I wrote Second Watch. It was an amazing book to write. Bo is older. The book starts with him on his way to the hospital for his his bilateral knee replacement surgery. And it's while he's under the influence of drugs that he has this drug-induced vision of Doug Davis. And he's in his hospital room, and there's this guy in Vietnam era fatigue standing over by the window. And when the guy turns around and walks toward Bo, he realizes it's Doug, the guy who was his commanding officer in Vietnam. And of course, Bo should have figured out it was a dream since he was looking at the Space Needle out of the wrong side of the hospital. But Doug comes walking over to his desk with this sort of half-assed grin on his face and looks at Bo and says, you got old. And of course, that's Bo's problem. He came back from Vietnam. He lived and had time to get old, and Doug never did. And that book is the story of the reconciliation of the fact that Beaumont never sought Bonnie out, never told her how sorry he was for her loss. And that reconciliation happens. I wrote that book in the hope that Doug and Bonnie's sacrifice and loss would not be forgotten. On the 50th anniversary of Doug's death, Bonnie went to Bisbee. She went to Evergreen Cemetery. And there she found that people who had read Second Watch had found their way to Bisbee, found their way to the cemetery, located Doug's grave, and left behind tokens of their esteem. I no longer have to feel guilty about not attending Doug's funeral.
Wow, what a great story. There have been a few people you'll be pleased to hear that went to school with you at the U of A. Let's see.
Bear down, Arizona.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments like that. Some people that were in Pima Hall, another one that was in Cochise Hall, from 67 to 70, which is right in the middle of that whole Vietnam era.
I was actually impeached as a song leader at Pima Hall for the house mother did not approve of my leading rousing choruses of "Roll me over in the clover, roll me over, lay me down and do it again." She didn't think that was appropriate.
I have a good question, and I know you've spoken about this before, but Anne, who's a frequent viewer, hey Anne, she says, I should know this, but I don't. What made you become a writer? It's a big question, but.
Dogged determination, because I wanted to become a writer from the time I encountered the Wizard of Oz books in second grade at Greenway School in Bisbee. I wasn't enthralled by the wizard, that funny little guy hiding behind the green curtain. I was enthralled by Frank Baum hiding behind the words. And once I realized that a living, breathing person put those words on the pages, that's what I wanted to be, and that's what I wanted to do. There were a whole lot of obstacles to my becoming a writer. For one thing, I wasn't allowed in the creative writing program at the University of Arizona in 1964 because, as the professor told me, quote, "You're a girl. Girls become teachers or nurses, boys become writers." I married a guy who was allowed in the class that was closed to me. He imitated Faulkner and Hemingway primarily by drinking too much and writing too little. He never had anything published, but that didn't keep him from telling me in 1968, there's only going to be one writer in our family and I'm it. So I didn't actually start writing until 12 years later, when I was a divorced single mother, 2 little kids, no child support, a full-time job selling life insurance. And the time I had to write was 4 o'clock in the morning until 7 o'clock in the morning, when I got the kids dressed to go to school and got me dressed to go sell life insurance. So when I encounter people who say, someday when my life is perfect, I'm going to be a writer too. And I always want to say, like hell, because real writers write when their lives are imperfect. If you want to wait until your life is perfect to start writing, you're never going to start.
I think it helps to be hungry.
It helps to be hungry.
In a literal sense, but.
Somebody asked me, what word would I use to describe myself? And I believe that word would be determined, because if you tell me it's not going to happen, that's a surefire way of making it happen.
Well, and you got a little bit of revenge, didn't you, on that
Oh,
professor?
Yes. Actually, if people read the first book in the Walker family series, Hour of the Hunter, they will find that the main character, Diana Ladd, is a teacher on the reservation, but she really wants to be a writer. Like me, she had a husband who was allowed in the creative writing program that was closed to her. He's dead at the beginning of the book. And the crazed killer turns out to be a former professor of creative writing from the University of Arizona. Now, the interesting thing, until a week ago, I had managed to blank that professor's name completely out of my random access memory. And someone from the U of A wrote to me and gave me his name, but I had managed to completely forget it. I believe that's called willful forgetting.
He probably had a full run of your novels on his shelf.
No, he did not. Both he and my first husband died before my first book was published in 1985. So I'm bad. I am a bad person to say this, but I always expect that every time I hit the New York Times list, those 2 guys are spinning in their graves. And I'm hoping a spinning session is coming for them with this book.
you mentioned the Walker family series, and that was one thing I wanted to ask you, and what several other people are asking too. When will we see another installment in that story?
Boy, I don't know. I was reading through one of those books for some reason a few weeks ago, and I thought, boy, I really had to learn a lot to be able to write this book. Learn a lot about the reservation geography, about the folklore on the reservation. I needed to know a lot, and I'm not sure I still have all of that stuff available to me. So I can't answer that question.
Right. Let's see. I know at one point for a long time, you maintained that that was your best book, The Hour of the Hunter. Do you still feel that way?
I think Hour of the Hunter is a remarkable piece of storytelling. The Beaumont books, it was my first non-first person book. The Beaumont books are written in a strict first person fashion. The reader only knows what Beau sees, hears, does, says, thinks. There are no other points of view allowed in those stories. So Hour of the Hunter was my first non-Beaumont book, and it is told through 7 or 8 different points of view with this elastic timeline that stretches back and forth over 70 years. And when I need to find one thing in that book, that's a book that will suck me in, and I'll have to read the whole book.
It was our best-selling book it probably is for me. It's our very best-selling J.A. Jance book. I thought it was a remarkable book. And let me add too, unless I'm completely crazy, but I am fairly sure that I attended the ceremony at University of Arizona where your archives are now part of the collection. And I remember that was a moment of revenge, for you. And it was a lot of fun for me because I heard the whole story behind it so often.
Not only are my papers there, my first computer, my dual floppy steam-driven Eagle with 128K of memory is there, along with all the manuals that made that Hummer work. When I came dragging home with my boyfriend at age 18, my parents took one look at him, and my dad said, "This guy's a raging alcoholic." And I said, "Oh, what do you know? You're just a couple of teetotalers." So then I was forced to spend the next 18 years of my life trying to prove my parents wrong, which of course they weren't. But once I married him, my dad was this old life insurance guy, and he had me buy a life insurance policy on my husband, $50,000 whole life policy, of which I was both the owner and the beneficiary. And I paid the premiums on that through thick and some very thin. When he died in March of 1983, I received the proceeds from that policy, and I took 10% of it, $5,000, and I invested it in my future as a writer. And I bought that Eagle computer and a daisy wheel printer with that daisy wheel printer. My God, try printing a 400-page manuscript with paper jams. But that was how I started writing. And I think that was probably the best investment of $5,000 I could ever have made.
Is there a reason, I know you've spoken about this before, but Patricia asks, is the history about women and in the writing business the reason that you chose the initials, J.A.?
I didn't choose them. I wrote the first Beaumont manuscript. I gave it to my agent, and the title page said, "Until Proven Guilty" by Judith A. Jance. But she had worked in the publishing industry in New York, and she knew that there was a lot of anti-female bias. So she rewrote the title page to read Until Proven Guilty by J.A. Jance and sent the manuscript in. The second editor who saw that, John Douglas from Avon Books, called my agent, Alice, and said, you know, the guy who wrote Until Proven Guilty is a really good writer. And she said, well, what would you say if I told you the guy who wrote Until Proven Guilty is a woman? And he said, I'd say she was a hell of a good writer. So he bought the book and they started the processing, the pre-publication process. And in 1984, the marketing people got a hold of it. They said, wait a minute. A police procedural with a male protagonist, first person narrative written by a woman, somebody named Judy. I don't think so. Male readers will never accept that. And so they proposed using my initials. And I said, I'm from Bisbee, Arizona. A New York publishing house is publishing my book. I don't care what they call me. So that's where J.A. Jance came from. And I am incredibly grateful. I always sign my books in red pens. And I can tell you that writing J.A. Jance is a lot easier than writing Judith and Jance. And so that using my initials has saved me literally miles of red ink over the years of signing books. But the real irony is my next door neighbor on bookshelves in bookstores and libraries is none other than P.D. James, who had to use her initials. I believe her real name is Phyllis Dorothy, for the same reason I did a generation and a half before I came along. And so I didn't choose it, other people did, but I certainly don't mind.
I'm going to add a footnote here, which I may never have told you, but frequently when I get information about how to run our conversations together, which we have been doing, as you know, since 1989, I am admonished to call you J.A. Jance. And, you know, I disregard that because I can't imagine sitting here and talking to you for an hour and call you J.A. instead of Judy. So I just ignore it. But that myth is actually still alive.
Actually, for the first 9 books, there was no author bio and no author photo on the books. And that gave rise to the rumor that a retired Seattle homicide cop writes these books.
Yeah.
So when the hardback started coming out and my picture was there, I thought that rumor would go away. It didn't, it just morphed. Then they started saying, well, a retired Seattle homicide cop writes these books and she's just a front for him. But I don't care. They're reading my books. It's no skin off my teeth.
You still get the royalty checks. So there we are. Patrick, anything else?
I could probably find some more. What's going on with Allie Reynolds? Will we see her again?
Well, we're actually going to see her in June when the book that's coming from Allie is, I finished writing Unfinished Business as the pandemic was starting. And then for a while, I couldn't get a grip, not Unfinished Business, Missing and Endangered, as the pandemic was starting. And then I wrote my blog and that was the best I could do for a few months. And then finally I got my grip again and wrote the next Allie book. It's called Unfinished Business. And it starts with a guy in prison in Washington State. And as soon as I realized that this was a case that was going to have aspects of it in both current Arizona and cold case Washington, well, who works cold cases in Washington but J.P. Beaumont? And why waste him? So I negotiated a peace treaty with my editors from both my publishing houses, Simon and Schuster for the Alley books and HarperCollins for the Beaumont books, and got permission from Harper to let Beaumont venture into this upcoming Alley book, Unfinished Business. So the Alley books are written in third person with multiple points of view. You see the story through different eyes as you go along. And I assumed that when I got to the Beaumont part, he would be third person right along with everybody else. Huh. Boy, was I in for a surprise. When I got to Beaumont, there he was talking to me in all his first person curmudgeonliness. And he just wouldn't do it any other way. So I said, I give up. You're first person, just tell me the story and we'll get on with it. So I sent the manuscript to my new editor at Simon & Schuster. And of course, she had never read any of the Beaumont books. So when she sent me back the line edited manuscript, she had changed all of the first person Beaumonts into third person. And instantly, he was a cardboard cutout character. He no longer walked, talked, and breathed. He was just a paper doll. And I wrote back and I said, I'm sorry, this is not going to work. If Beau can't be in first person, he isn't going to be in this book. So the Beaumont parts of Unfinished Business are definitely J.P. Beaumont, first person, the way we've all always known him. And that's coming in June.
Wonderful. Well, we will certainly look forward to talking to you about it. Is it going to be up in Allie's normal home territory?
Yes, most of the Arizona action takes place in and around Sedona, some in Mayer, some in, okay, that little town's name has fallen out of my head. Anyway, it's up and around the Sedona area,
Wonderful.
Sedona and Cottonwood.
Well, we will certainly look forward to it. Maybe you can even whisk in Jerome for, a moment, which will be really fun. Anyway, it's been lovely talking to you. We probably kept you long enough this evening. It's been an hour and 15 minutes. Who would have imagined that?
How many people did we have in attendance?
Well, we have a lot, but it isn't about how many people are watching it right now. It's about how many people will have watched it 3 days from now. It just rockets right up. So I'll send you the link for those of you watching. There will be a podcast that'll be generated tomorrow. So you can recommend for people who don't want to sit in front of a computer screen, they can download the podcast and listen to it. This video will stay on our Facebook page. And Patrick, who is seriously overworked, but eventually we'll find time to put this,
I'm catching up.
on YouTube, because we know there are people who would prefer to watch it on YouTube. And if you choose the YouTube channel, you can actually watch it on your smart TV, which is really nice. So we try to cover all the bases. Anyway, it's really been a delight. I'm so glad we got to talk about Bisbee. This is the very first time I think we've actually ranged around Bisbee. And Patrick, we do have Going Back to Bisbee available by Richard Shelton. And if this has piqued your interest.
Another book I hope you will keep in stock is Marshall Trimble's Roadside History of Arizona.
Yes, we do.
Because when people are driving through Arizona, that is an invaluable resource to know what's happened where you are.
It really is. Marshall's done some events with us and we've talked about it. I also like Roadside Geology of Arizona. And in fact, one day I made the mistake of taking a copy when Rob and I went out. And we're traveling through all this beautiful country. Where am I? My head's in the book. And by the time I have read them, I look up and we've already flashed past whatever it was that we are. So I recommend that you read Roadside Geology of Arizona before you go and visit wherever it is. Otherwise, you will be like me with your head in the book. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. We have actually not a whole lot of signed copies, as we showed you, autographed copies of Missing and Endangered with the famous J.A. Jance red signature. So grab one while you can. And we thank you for doing that. I know it's a lot of work, and I wish we could send a person to come to your home and unpack books and help you do it and pack them back up again. So you've been a big sport to do that for us during the pandemic, Judy. So we really thank you very much. So good night, everybody, and see you soon.
Happy trails.
Thank you. Good night, Patrick.
Good night.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.